Someone called on the Black Plague. I'm here. In this part 2, I'm going to talk about why we have recurrent intensifying crises, why we don't learn the right lessons from our past crises. And in it, we're going to discover something that, of course, you've been hearing. The dominant economists are truly terrible at one thing. They are terrible at economics. But occasionally they go beyond economics, and they are abysmal on ethics. And they are the leading opponents and dangers to democracy throughout the EU in particular, but in America as well. Economists tell us they want to be judged on their predictive ability. We welcome their admission because their record in prediction is pitiful. But of course, it is precisely the fact that they've been wrong about everything important for 3 decades that makes them unwilling to admit their error and ever more insistent on continuing their worst policy advice. As I said, economics is particularly awful when it gets into the concept of morality. In my first talk, I read you a quotation from the economist who conducted the study of the savings and loan crisis. And he pointed out that it was rational for looters to make bad loans. Well, here is the reaction of one economist, Greg Mankiw, to hearing the work of that National Commission and of that Nobel Prize winner-to-be, George Akerlof. He listened to their story and he said, and this is not an offhand comment, he was the official discussant. He had the paper a week in advance. He thought about these remarks. He said it would be irrational for savings and loan CEOs not to loot. So note that he goes from simply a statement about how you maximize fraud by making bad loans to the ethical proposition that if it would be rational action, it must be the appropriate action, even though the rational action is to defraud. Now, there's a very interesting book called Moral Markets that had the unfortunate timing to come out in 2008 because it is a triumphal book about capitalism and about how capitalism makes markets more moral. But even it contains this statement: Homo economicus is a sociopath. Homo economicus is what happens if people behave the way economists predict that they will behave. And these scholars who loved capitalism said, if you do that, you will create a nation of sociopaths. Greg Mankiw is not a random economist. President Bush made him chairman of the President's Council of Economic Advisor, the most prominent economic position in America after he had said these things. The next two gentlemen are the leading law and economics scholars on corporate law. And I'm quoting from their treatise in 1991. So an entire generation of US lawyers have been taught this next phrase: a rule against fraud is not an essential or an important ingredient of securities markets. The key economist there, who's not really an economist, is a lawyer, is Daniel Fischel. He worked for 3 of the worst control frauds, including the absolute worst savings and loan control fraud, praised them as the best firms in America, and then wrote this 2 years later without ever admitting in his book that he had tried his theories in the real world and they had led him to praise the worst frauds. So this is rank academic dishonesty on top of getting everything wrong. And what happened to Fischel after he got everything wrong? He was made dean of the University of Chicago Law School, one of the most prominent academic positions in America. Alan Greenspan also worked for the worst fraud in the savings and loan crisis, Charles Keating's Lincoln Savings. And he personally recruited as a lobbyist for this worst fraud the 5 US senators who would intervene with us to try to prevent us from taking enforcement action against the largest violation in the history of our agency, because that violation was by Charles Keating and Lincoln Savings. And those 5 senators became known and ridiculed as the Keating 5. By the way, John McCain was one of those senators who met with us. Alan Greenspan then wrote a letter saying that we should allow Lincoln Savings to do these terrible investments because they posed no foreseeable risk of loss to the federal insurance fund. Lincoln Savings proved to be the largest cost to the insurance fund. After he had gotten it as wrong as it is possible to get something wrong, we made him chairman of the Federal Reserve. So here you have a record of we promote and honor in economics the people who get it spectacularly wrong, as long as they get it wrong for powerful banks that are frauds. So what did they predict? This is the short list. Neoclassical economists predicted that because markets were efficient, they were self-correcting, fraud was automatically excluded, and financial bubbles could not occur. They assured us that because of bankers' interest in their reputations, and auditors and appraisers, that they would never commit a fraud and never assist a fraud. They predicted that massive financial derivatives would stabilize the economic system. They told us, even when the bubble had reached proportions larger than any in the history of the world, that there was no housing bubble in the United States, that there was no housing bubble in Ireland, that there was no housing bubble in Japan, that there was no housing bubble in Spain. They told us that if we paid CEOs massive amounts of money based on short-term performance that was fictional. It would align the interests of the CEO with the shareholders and the public and be the best possible thing. Every one of these predictions proved utterly false. Actually, every single one of these predictions had been falsified before the economist ever said them. And they did not change. What did they do back in the day? They looked at Europe. This is Cato, named, of course, after a famous Roman, a very conservative anti-think tank in the United States. Cato, in 2007, as Iceland was collapsing in massive fraud, said these words: "Iceland's economic renaissance is an impressive story. Supply-side reforms," that means tax cuts, "along with policies such as privatization and deregulation, have yielded predictable results." Remember, we're making predictions. "Incomes are rising, unemployment is almost non-existent, and the government is collecting more revenue from a larger tax base." So they cut taxes, but overall tax revenue grows because the country is growing at a massive rate. Why? Because the big three banks in Iceland are all accounting control frauds. They are growing at an average rate of 50% every year. And by the time they collapse in 2008, they are 10 times the GDP of Iceland, and they suffer 60% losses on their assets. That was their prediction of proof, positive, that deregulation, low taxes, privatization produce economic booms. They said something very similar about Ireland in an article entitled, "It's Not Luck." Ireland boasts the 4th highest gross domestic product per capita in the world. In the mid-1980s, Ireland was a backwater with an average income level 30% below that of the European Union. Today, Irish incomes are 40% above the EU average. Was this dramatic change the luck of the Irish? Not at all. It resulted from a series of hard-headed decisions that shifted Ireland from big government stagnation to free market growth. And they wrote this in 2007, a year after the Irish bubble had popped and Ireland was going into free fall. And what are we being told now is the answer? Hard-headed decisions that shift the governments from big government stagnation to free market growth. They have learned absolutely nothing from their past failed predictions. In fact, Trichet came to Ireland in 2004 and said Ireland should be the model for nations joining the European Union. But we have seen this movie many times before in many countries. We had seen it in the savings and loan crisis. But then came the Enron era crisis and WorldCom. And I'll focus on just one aspect. Again, we had accounting control frauds that drove an immense crisis. But what people forget is that most of the world's largest banks eagerly aided and abetted Enron's frauds. They knew Enron was engaged in fraud, and they thought that was a good thing because they would get more deal flow, as we say, more volume. These frauds were documented extensively by investigations, hundreds of pages about it. Not a single one of the large conventional bankers was prosecuted. There was a prosecution about Merrill Lynch, which the courts obstructed. Indeed, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that only the government could bring civil suits against, and enforcement actions, of course, against banks that aided and abetted fraud. Think of that. You could have indisputable proof that the bank had aided Enron, knowingly done so, caused you billions of dollars of losses, and you could not sue the bank. That's how bad the law has become in the United States. So that left us with, will the government sue? Well, the Federal Reserve, we now know from recent testimony in front of the National Commission that investigated this current crisis, the leadership actively resisted bringing any action against the banks, even what we call a slap on the wrist. And it was only when the Securities and Exchange Commission took a slap on the wrist that the Federal Reserve was embarrassed into taking any action. We also know from this extraordinary testimony by the longtime head of supervision at the Federal Reserve that he was deeply disturbed by the fact that most of the largest banks in the world had aided Enron's fraud. So he put together a comprehensive briefing for the leadership of the Federal Reserve. At that meeting, the senior officials of the Federal Reserve and the senior economists of the Federal Reserve did not criticize Enron, and they did not criticize the banks that aided Enron's frauds. They were enraged at the supervisor. How dare he criticize banks? And this was the era, and continues in the United States to be the era of reinventing government, which is a neoclassical, neoliberal, be soft on bankers. And I witnessed personally when our Washington staff came at a training conference and instructed us that we were to refer to banks as our clients. We were the regulators, and we were not only supposed to refer to them as clients, we were supposed to treat them as clients. Being a quiet type, I stood up and began protesting, and they simply shouted us down. All right. So this is occurring in 2001, 2002, 2003, 2004. At that point, Italy enters the picture. And Italy enters the picture because of Parmalat. And it enters the picture because, again, you have a massive accounting control fraud where the CEO is looting Parmalat and taking the money out of Italy to tax havens where he can hide it in a wave of special complex corporate forms designed to hide the fraud. And what does the Federal Reserve say about all of this? Well, first, they brag about their enforcement action. Note that they won't name the large institutions. In these enforcement actions, certain large institutions were required to revise their risk management practices, where examiners found failures by these institutions to identify those transactions that presented heightened legal and reputational risk, particularly in cases where transactions were used to facilitate a customer's accounting or tax objective that resulted in misrepresenting the company's true financial condition to the public and regulators. So this is another passage that requires translation, not because it's in English, but because it's in gobbledygook. So what are they really saying? First, they're bragging about an enforcement action that they tried very hard not to bring and which was utterly useless. Second, note what their concern is. Their concern is, if I can roll this, yes, heightened legal and reputational risk. They're worried that when the bank aids Enron or Parmalat's frauds, they'll get caught. And then their reputation will suffer. They're not worried about Enron shareholders. They're not worried about the 12,000 Enron employees who lose their jobs. They're not worried about Parma's economy. None of that matters. They don't even discuss it. And they're not worried about morality. Call me old school. But I thought when I was a regulator, if the banks I was regulating were engaged in fraud, first, my job was to stop it. Second, my job was to remove the CEO from office. Third, my job was to help prosecute him and put him in prison. And fourth, my job was to sue him so that he walked away with not a lira or a euro or a dollar. But all of that is gone. But you know this because you have probably seen a gem of a film. First ring. And you know probably what Citicorp called this special vehicle it created to facilitate the looting of Parmalat. Somehow I think this means black hole. That's what they called it. And this is so wonderful. Citicorp eventually said it regretted one thing: calling it buco nero. The only thing it was honest about is the only thing Citicorp regretted. What it did to Italy and Parma, not so much. So what did people find in this crisis? This is the National Commission report on our crisis. We conclude widespread failures in financial regulation and supervision proved devastating to the stability of the nation's financial markets. The sentries were not at their posts due to the widely accepted faith in the self-correcting nature of the markets and the ability of financial institutions to effectively police themselves. It specifically blames Greenspan and his deregulatory ideology that could have helped avoid a catastrophe. But those are words. Here's an image. The person, let's see if my cursor, yes, this man. He is Chainsaw Gillerin. That translates very well into Italian, I see. He was the head of the agency I used to work for. He is standing next to the 3 leading bank lobbyists in America and the guy who will be his successor. They are poised and posed over a pile of federal regulations. And if that's too subtle, they are tied up in red tape. And the message is, we will work with our client, the banks, to destroy all regulation. And the reason we bring a chainsaw is to make clear that everything will be destroyed. Well, what about Europe? There was a conservative dissent to the conclusions I've just read. They claimed that deregulation could not have been a major cause of the crisis in America because the crisis also occurred in Europe. That's all they said. They implicitly assumed that Europe must have been tough on bank regulation. I will conclude with these words from the report on the Irish crisis. There were generic weaknesses in EU regulation and supervision. So the dissent has it exactly wrong. They're right. It's important to look at Europe. And the same causal mechanism, deregulation, desupervision, and this absurd executive compensation swept Europe and America. And the economists got what they wanted and predicted it would be wonderful. It produced a catastrophe.